Welcome to today's webinar entitled Managing Trade Policy Risk in Turbulent Times, which is brought to you by the European American Chamber of Commerce of Greater Cincinnati. The EACC is where Europeans and Americans connect to do business. I'm Todd Schwartz, Executive Director of the Cincinnati chapter of the EACC, and I'll be your host and moderator today. We have a good number of registrants for today's event, so I'm sure we'll have a vibrant and informational discussion. One quick disclaimer. Please note all comments and opinions presented by our speakers today are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the European American Chamber of Commerce or of its members. The U.S. Department of Commerce reports that in 2018, the Cincinnati Metropolitan Statistical Area, which covers Southwest Ohio, Southeast Indiana, and Northern Kentucky, was the number 12 metropolitan area exporter ranked by dollar value of exports. That puts us ahead of areas like New York and Los Angeles and Chicago. That puts us behind areas like New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, but places us ahead of regions like Philadelphia or Atlanta and Boston. And for what it's worth, we are ranked 29th by population, so 12th, 29th. It is more challenging to measure imports by MSA, but clearly international trade is vital for our region's economic health and growth. The international trade policy has long been a contentious issue. Some of you may remember Ross Perot's reference in 1992 to the giant sucking sound of U.S. jobs being lost to Mexico if the North American Free Trade Agreement was passed. But in recent years, trade seems to have become a contact sport as nations impose tariffs and counter tariffs and export restrictions on everything from airplanes to bourbon to handbags and, of course, on primary goods like aluminum and steel. At the same time, international organizations like the World Trade Organization, designed to help mediate these disputes, have become sclerotic and even paralyzed. All this presents challenges to companies engaged in trade, and in particular, manufacturers in our region, which import primary and intermediate goods, transform them into other intermediate or finished goods, and then sell them into domestic and international markets. Importers are the ones who have to pay those tariffs. And if the widgets you buy from Italy get hit with a tariff, well, what does that do to your bottom line? What does that do to your operating costs? What does that do to the prices that you charge your customers? What tools are available to manufacturers to mitigate and manage such risks? Here to help us try to make sense of this turbulent trade environment is David Schwartz, Practice Group Leader for International Trade at Thompson Hine, who will describe how we got here and maybe offer some hints on where we may be going. Then we will hear from Melissa Johnson, Program Director for the Greater Cincinnati Foreign Trade Zones for the Port, and from Samantha Wagner, Head of Trade Compliance for Festo in Mason, Ohio. Melissa and Samantha will explain what a foreign trade zone is, how and why they are established, and what a company can and cannot do in a foreign trade zone. Samantha will also provide her perspective as an operator of a foreign trade zone, some of the headaches it can create and those it can help resolve. Most importantly, Melissa and Samantha will demonstrate how a foreign trade zone may help importers better manage costs and mitigate risks in an unpredictable trade policy environment. Now, a reminder, if you have any questions or comments throughout the event, please feel free to enter them into your GoToWebinar control panel at any time. We'll try to address them as we go along, or we may deal with most of them towards the end of the program. So, David, let's start with you. Other than trade attorneys and policy wonks like me, most people find trade policy discussions to be deadly boring. Why now is trade policy such a hot topic, and what might be lying ahead out there?
Great question, Todd, and good morning, Cincinnati, and to those of you participating in this webinar today. Trade has been brought to the forefront thanks to President Trump. It was one of the primary issues he ran on in 2016. He brought it out of the dark corners and made it a popular issue for the voters. He made it clear that he was very unhappy with decades of U.S. trade policy, that we were losing, that we were being taken advantage of. President Trump had been writing about trade issues going back to the 80s when he had books published discussing his take on all things policy-wise, and trade was always among those issues that he addressed. I think in order to understand why trade matters still, we need to get inside the head of President Trump and understand how in the past 4 years, he's overhauled almost 40 years of US trade policy. Once I describe that to you, I'll discuss what he has done in his first term, and then I'll talk about what would happen in a second Trump term and what would happen under Joe Biden if he's elected as president. What President Trump has done in the last 4 years has been nothing short of transformational. The United States, for decades, embraced multilateralism, working with other countries and other allies to address global trade policy issues. Dare I say that the United States led on many of these issues and was instrumental in the formation of the World Trade Organization in the mid-1990s, which advanced free trade policies to the point where the WTO introduced binding dispute settlement among countries that have binational or plurilateral disputes among themselves. President Trump, as we know, in the 2016 election, made it clear that the United States, was on the losing end of trade disputes. And he made it very clear that the reason we were on the losing end is because we were suffering from a trade in goods deficit. Now, President Trump, as you no doubt are aware, views life as a zero-sum game. There are winners and there are losers. We hear that term quite a bit, winners and losers. And for President Trump, he measures whether we're doing well in the area of trade and whether or not we have a bilateral trade in goods balance that favors us. He does not take into account trade in services. He only looks at trade in goods. And because he only looks at trade in goods, it's clear that with many countries, the United States does have a deficit in trade in goods, even though with most countries, the United States has a surplus in trade and services. But again, the president has always looked at trade in terms of manufacturing, in terms of tangible goods. And there we have had a deficit. So his focus has been on how can we address the trade in goods deficit. Because he likes to keep score, he's found it extremely difficult to look at any relationships except bilateral ones to determine whether you're winning or losing. If you're participating in a multinational trade agreement, it's hard to figure out who's winning or losing. There's just too many parties involved. So the president has done something that, again, is considered radical. He's abandoned the multilateral approach towards trade, which the United States championed for decades, and is focused primarily on bilateral relationships because it's easy to keep score. It's easy to figure out if we're winning or losing. And in order to focus on these bilateral relationships, the president, as he has learned in his life as a real estate developer, the president needs leverage in order to negotiate these bilateral trade relationships. And for him, as we heard a lot in 2016, as we've heard since, he needed leverage in the form of tariffs. And that's exactly the steps that the president has taken over the last few years. He's focused on bilateral relationships. He's focused on bilateral trade negotiations. And we've seen that we've had a couple of existing free trade agreements renegotiated, the one with Korea and the one with Mexico and Canada. We went from NAFTA to the USMCA. And we're in the process of negotiating new bilateral trade agreements involving Japan, Kenya, the UK, and even the EU. To show you his disdain for multilateral arrangements, within the first week of his presidency, he pulled the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a plurilateral agreement involving many Asian countries and the United States. Ironically, he has used significant portions of the TPP as templates for what was later negotiated as to be the USMCA. But for the most part,
David, just one question on that. Just to be clear, I mean, remembering this isn't a Republican versus Democrat. I mean, Hillary Clinton, didn't she express opposition to the TPP as part of her candidacy at one point?
She did, and I think that
for different reasons, though, right?
Right.
Yeah,
well,
okay.
and I think that President Trump has, in many ways, taken on what would be considered traditionally Democratic Party policies that focus on, I guess you could call it protectionist or pro-U.S. domestic trade policy. And those have traditionally been policies that have been promoted by the Democratic Party. The passage of NAFTA in the 90s was the handiwork, well, the NAFTA itself was the handiwork of George H.W. Bush.
Yeah.
And President Clinton brought it over the finish line, but he had to twist a lot of arms in his own party to get that done, and only passed by a handful of votes.
Right.
So the policies that President Trump has followed in his first term, you would see that there are many Democratic Party members of Congress who are supportive of it, who champion it. Sherrod Brown, for example, I'm sure is strongly supportive of many of the policies that President Trump has promoted. And Hillary Clinton in 2016, I think that she had to distance herself from actions that the Obama administration may have taken multilaterally, because Trump was raising trade as such an important issue that she had to take a position. And in order to win votes domestically, she took what would be considered the traditional Democratic Party position, which
Right.
Trump was claiming for himself.
Right. Okay. Sorry, not to get off track. Thanks.
Well, I do want to mention one other step that President Trump has taken, moving us away from multilateralism, because it's important. I mentioned how the United States had championed for decades multilateralism, the promotion of trade negotiations among many countries, and how we were in the forefront of getting the World Trade Organization established. Well, President Trump has been involved in driving the WTO to a dead stop. The United States has refused to support the appointment of panelists to the appellate body of the WTO, which has effectively hamstrung the dispute settlement body. Again, what distinguishes the WTO from prior trade forum is that it has a binding dispute settlement mechanism. Well, now that binding dispute settlement mechanism is not working because the United States has refused to approve nominated panelists to serve as part of that dispute settlement body. What can we expect from President Trump in a second term? More of the same. He will continue with negotiations bilaterally. We still have phase 2 with China hanging out there. As you know, we did have that phase 1 deal, which involved us using the leverage of tariffs, the Section 301 tariffs, and then China in turn retaliated with their own tariffs. I think it's fair to say you will see more trade brinksmanship. You will see President Trump threatening, using tariffs, using whatever other leverage is available to him to force other countries and groupings like the European Union to the table to negotiate. I think that you'll see that process play out again with China. You'll see it play out with the European Union, because not only do we just have a whole array of issues with the EU, and many of them arise from WTO cases that have allowed both the EU and the US to apply tariffs to one another. If you all have been reading about the Airbus-Boeing subsidies dispute, which has gone on for more than a decade, well, now it's finally coming to a head, and the WTO has approved both the United States and the EU to take action, retaliatory tariffs. That should bring both countries to the table to negotiate a settlement to get rid of these tariffs, because it's hurting business in both the EU and in the United States. Something else on the horizon that it'll be interesting to see how the Trump administration will react is the renewal of Trade Promotion Authority in July 2021. Trade Promotion Authority, it used to be known as Fast Track, allows the United States to get free trade agreements passed with an up and down vote in Congress, and disallows members of Congress to amend or make changes to an existing free trade agreement. So having what they call Trade Promotion Authority allows an FTA, once it's negotiated, to be passed with just an up and down vote. And people are wondering whether President Trump will even bother to get TPA passed when it expires in the summer of 2021, because as we know, during his first term, he is focused on doing these deals, these phase one deals with Japan, with China. And these deals don't rise to the level of a free trade agreement, so they haven't required any sort of approval from Congress. So he's had this workaround the FTA process by coming up with these deals. And he may just proceed along that course and continue doing these phases of deals and not even have to bother with a formal free trade agreement. Let's talk about what would happen in a Biden administration. There are a lot of knowns and unknowns. What's known, because Vice President Biden has made it known, is that there would be a return to multilateralism. There would be a return, not only in trade, but in all areas of foreign policy, towards working with our allies to get things done. I think that many of the Trump policies may stay in place, but there will certainly be a change in tone, and there will certainly be more cooperation with our allies to achieve many of the policies that President Trump has already put in place. I think that the return to multilateralism, the return to multilateral cooperation under a President Biden will likely lead to an effort to renew Trade Promotion Authority in the summer of 2021. I think that President Biden will try to follow all the legal mechanisms and legal requirements, and that he will likely want to negotiate with more than one company. He'll move away from the bilateral agreements to plurilateral or multilateral agreements. So I think you will see an effort to renew Trade Promotion Authority and to get these trade agreements approved by Congress. Vice President Biden, as president, has already made it clear that he would re-enter, for example, the Paris Climate Accords. It's another example of how he would participate again in multilateralism. It's unclear whether he would promptly move to get us into what now exists as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but he would certainly explore the opportunity to do so. Again, that was considered a significant achievement of the Obama administration. They worked very hard. You could argue that they were the prime movers behind it. And you could certainly see in a Biden administration that the United States would move toward participation in that once again. And I think it's fair to say that a President Biden would try to negotiate solutions for the World Trade Organization so that it works again. I think that he will still push for the very reforms that the U.S. TR Ambassador Lighthizer and President Trump want from the WTO. But President Biden will be less confrontational and will try to work with allies in the WTO to ensure that changes are made at the WTO so that the WTO can start functioning again and work to the benefit of everyone, including the United States. And this will be the last section that I'll be addressing concerning a Biden administration, and that is the unknowns involving President Biden. And what we don't quite know is how he will be responding to existing policies put in place by President Trump. I think it's fair to say that a President Biden, because he said this much on the campaign trail, is that he's going to focus on his Build Back Better domestic policies. So that's going to be his primary focus. He's going to try to be getting the economy up and running again post-pandemic, whenever that will be. But he'll also be pushing forward just a number of his domestic policies under this Build Back Better campaign, which will occur regardless of where we are in the pandemic, focusing on infrastructure. And as part of that emphasis on infrastructure, Vice President Biden has made it clear that he wants government contracts that would arise out of infrastructure opportunities to be handed out to U.S. companies and to create more jobs for those U.S. companies. Right now, government contracts are competitive, and there are, under the government procurement agreement, under the WTO and other arrangements and our free trade agreements with other countries and other companies in those countries are able to participate on government contract bidding.
At least at the federal level.
Yes, at the federal level. At the federal, yes, thank you. That's an important distinction to make. But clearly, what a President Biden is advocating would be taking place at the federal level. Much of the legislation and activities he wants to undertake are from the federal government. So it's clear that he will be taking steps to promote U.S. manufacturing and U.S. activity in that sense. He hasn't come out on the record about how he would handle the existing China Section 301 tariffs. He has made it clear, as Todd did in his introduction, that he knows that U.S. importers of record are paying those tariffs, and he knows that it's hurting U.S. businesses and that it's hurting U.S. consumers. He's aware of that. He's also aware that in this campaign that he's been portrayed as being weak on China, and that might lead him, at least in the short term, not to directly address the Section 301 tariffs. However, he has made it clear that any approach that he would take to the problems that we have with China, and he recognizes, as President Trump does, that we have significant issues with China across the board, not only with trade, but with human rights and with the conduct of business in China. And what President Biden said he would do is work with our allies. Again, here's this element of multilateralism. He wouldn't go at it alone. He would summon our allies and work with them to apply pressure. So given that idea, it sounds as if President Biden wants leverage in dealing with China, but he doesn't necessarily want to use tariffs as leverage, but he wants to use the collective force of our allies working with him in negotiations with China to get change done. And I think finally, since I've talked about Section 301 tariffs, I should also mention Section 232 tariffs, the ones involving steel and aluminum. Those tariffs still remain politically popular with the domestic metal agencies, even if not with end users of those products. So I don't see him, again, like with the Section 301 China tariffs, doing anything in the short term. But with both the Section 301 tariffs and the Section 232 tariffs, they're facing both domestic court challenges and challenges at the World Trade Organization. And I think it's important to appreciate that a President Biden, I think, will respect legal decisions that may adversely affect the existence of the Section 301 and Section 232 tariffs. So he will, if there is a decision that's made, probably accept them and respond to them in a way that we do observe all the legal safeguards that he's been instructed to follow. One last point on that. There are issues with how the Section 301 China tariffs have been carried out. And I think it's clear that a Biden administration would recognize all the procedural requirements to implement Section 301 tariffs, to implement the exclusion process for products subject to the Section 301 tariffs. That's currently the subject of much litigation here in the United States.
Let me stop there. Go ahead, Samantha.
I've just got it's a question and a comment, and it's probably a little naive from my side, not being so involved with some of these trade things, but it's almost counterintuitive for these 232 and 301 tariffs, because you're telling the importers that we should buy American and we should source this via, America, but you're taking all of the money that we would have to use that and invest in that infrastructure because we're paying the punitive tariffs. So you almost wish that there was something on the back end of that agreement that would say, okay, here, if you're going to show that you're doing A, B, and C to buy American, you'll get some kind of tax break or refund on those punitive damages, punitive tariffs or something that would then help really push that buy American, pro-American trade. And that's the part I just don't see.
I can't disagree with you. I don't think that these tariff policies have worked as perhaps intended, but that hasn't stopped the president from claiming that they have. He still claims that China is paying the Section 301 tariffs, and he's not moving off that spot. So if you're claiming that position, then it's hard to get past it and explain the adverse effect it's having here in the United States. But if you start from the position, as again Todd mentioned and as I've mentioned, that we know, those of us in the trade community, that these tariffs are paid by U.S. companies, then you have a completely different view of its impact.
Yeah,
exactly.
And I think I think you just put your finger on it, is that sometimes the unintended consequences of shifts in trade policy is part of what makes all of these things so frustrating for manufacturers, because hey, we do this and the Europeans impose a tariff on bourbon or whatever. You never know where those responses are going to come. I mean, we've dealt with this. I mean, you talked largely about sort of the U.S. point of view. I mean, when it comes to trade, you also have to consider, well, how do our partners react? And you look at what China has done, and you look what the Europeans have done, and others. So, and again, these are the things that impact our companies. But anything that you have talked about now could be the subject of its own entire webinar, probably its own series of webinars. I mean, I think that the underlying point that we want to make here is that companies who are involved in any kind of international trade obviously need to be paying very, very close attention to this, and I'm sure they are. They're working with their attorneys, they're working with their logistics companies and other partners, and they are also have to be looking at ways to manage and mitigate that trade policy risk, which of course, again, is kind of why we're here. Just a reminder, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to submit those using the question section of the GoToWebinar panel. So with that in mind, and with the kind of backdrop of trade policy as a mess, and it's not a Democratic problem, it's not a Republican problem, it's just a problem. Let's turn to Melissa and Samantha, and I believe the two of you are going to walk us through some of the nuts and bolts issues of how a foreign trade zone works and how companies might use them to address some of the trade policy risks that David has described.
Absolutely. Good morning. Thanks, Todd. Thanks, David. It was interesting to listen to your comments and perspective you shared this morning. You know, I can relate, representing the foreign trade zone, that we had a number of manufacturers in panic and reaching out for a multitude of solutions, whether it was with their general counsel or their attorney, you know, tax attorney or whoever it might be. The foreign trade zone, regrettably, in some of the tariff proclamations was, you know, kind of expressly written out. And Samantha, you could probably speak to better than I can about, you know, the status of privileged foreign status, you know, goods coming into the U.S. and how regrettably the foreign trade zone was not going to be a solution in those instances, except to maybe provide, you know, relief on MPF or some, you know, logistical benefits, which is a true, you know, benefit of the program moving forward. But what we'd like to do today, I think, is to give this audience some framework around the foreign trade zone, what it is, why it exists, what's it, you know, how's it functioning in Cincinnati, and I can elaborate a little more while Todd pulls up our slides as to who I represent, and then the players involved in the foreign trade zone. And then Samantha also, the foreign trade zone is actually an independent entity. So my day job, if you will, is with the Port Authority here in Cincinnati, but we act as the executive staff to the foreign trade zone here in what is called Zone 46 and 47, which is Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky. Samantha not only is an operator with Festo, an amazing company, she's also one of our grantee board members. So I have to be on my best behavior, having one of our board members on, but we always find it to be hopefully an informative approach that I can, you know, give some background on the framework, and then Samantha can really talk about what it means to a company to actually employ this kind of program, the benefits, you know, the headache, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So yeah, with that, we'll just jump right in. So Todd's going to drive for us. Thank you. So we'll just, yeah, but this is great. This is a good start. This is just a little snapshot for those of you not familiar with foreign trade zones. They've been around for quite some time. They're part of the Federal Trade Administration, and there are a significant number of companies throughout the U.S. that take advantage of this. There are certain industries or functions that for which this will prevail. That's primarily manufacturing or warehouse distribution. And the list provided on your screen are just the industries that we see foreign trade zones to be the most active. So in Cincinnati, we do have representation of the machinery and equipment, plastics. We do have actually the Marathon Petroleum Refinery in Catlettsburg as a part of our territory as well. So we have a good composition of any number of these industries here in our own local region, but I think they're pretty common throughout other FTZs noted around the US. Next slide, please. So I just, you know, I think it's important to get the lay of the land and who's involved in a foreign trade zone. The Federal Trade Administration, as I mentioned, is really the overarching source of the FTZ. And so they are instituting the program from the federal level, providing policy and oversight. They are the clearinghouse for applications. When a company wants to consider actually applying for a designation of an FTZ, the federal board takes that into consideration. They have a public comment process, and there's, you know, a number of steps involved, although they've tried to refine those and reduce the time in which they're reviewing applications to be more at the speed of business. And I think they've done a great job of doing that over the past, you know, 5-6 years as they've transitioned to what's called an alternative site framework. We won't bore you with that detail, but you know, we've seen a lot of great progress to be responsive and understanding that companies need to be, you know, actively trying to, you know, gain a better global competitive position, and they've done a great job at doing that. I represent the grantee. So the grantee is essentially the organizations that have been granted a license from the federal board to operate a zone territory, which means it's a geographic footprint that we're responsible for promoting, working with companies on a day-to-day basis in you know, their operation of a zone. We act as a liaison back to the federal government and with Customs, who is the regulatory oversight of this program. So we enter into local agreements with companies, kind of agreeing to terms and conditions of being an operator here in Cincinnati or elsewhere. Those are a common fundamental piece of an FTZ. And then we report back the activity to the federal board for what we see and what we have going on in our own service territory in 46 and 47, in some of the activity that we capture here in Cincinnati. As I mentioned, Customs and Border Protection does exactly their job. They monitor the day-to-day movement of goods and inventory. Since the goods are technically not considered to be in the U.S. commerce system because they're destined for or in a foreign trade zone, they're exempt from that tariff or that duty until something happens to them. And Samantha and I'll talk a little bit about what that something is. But in the meantime, Customs is keeping a close eye. They can, come say hi and, just check things out with you every now and again. We're fortunate that we have Officer Robert Ash is our Customs and Border Protection officer out of Erlanger. He's fantastic. He's not as scary as what, you may expect, but they are a really great partner here locally with us. And Samantha, you can comment on that as well, but I'll actually turn it over to Samantha and she can talk about, the role of the operator user and what that means inside of the FTZ.
Sure, I'd love to. Good morning, everybody. Let me just make two comments quickly. One, I think that's important is the grantee can differ depending on the setup and the region in which you're in. So here, we've got the port is kind of working, with the companies to do it. It can also be a government agency. It could be the local county, could be the local town even that could act as the grantee. It just depends on the setup. And as far as Melissa's comment on Customs and Border Protection, I think for us in the Cincinnati area, it's a blessing and a privilege that we have Officer Ash. There are certain ports that do not have as big of an FTZ presence, and so they don't have as many customs officers that may have the knowledge that he has. And so it's quite interesting when you work as an operator in one of those ports because you're almost training Customs and Border Protection as you go with what the FTZs are and how to interpret those rules. And sometimes, they have a slightly different interpretation. And I'm sure that Melissa can also speak to it that, depending on what Customs and Border Protection oversight you have in your area, they could have a very different take on those rules and regulations. And it just really depends. Thankfully, Officer Ash is very pro-business and understands that we still need to be able to work as a business, even though we need to have this oversight and kind of go by these rules and regulations. So that's really good for us. And I think as a user operator, there are challenges. I'll be brutally honest, as Melissa kind of stated in the beginning, you get the good, the bad, and the ugly. The FTZ has some really great benefits, some that are kind of tangible, some that are a little more intangible. We'll get into some of the tangible ones, but some of the ones that she's got listed here that are the intangible, they really force you as a business to have better inventory control. Because you need to account for your zone inventory, because you need to have certain things in place for your business, really forces you to look at your policies and procedures that maybe the company was a little loose on or kind of, made up as they go along. You really need to have them strictly and stringently in place. And what you get from that is really an improvement in your processes and procedures. All of a sudden things flow a little smoother and you have a little more transparency and visibility to things. In your facility operations, in your security, even for your buildings, in your inventory control, just even in your ability to run certain reports for upper management. We were talking about the 232 and the 301 tariffs, gives you just a little more insight to some of those things because you're dealing with that for your inventory and for your reporting. So.
Thanks, Samantha. Todd, we can move to the next slide. I think one of the key takeaways here is that as the grantee, I am your first starting point, your first point of contact to engage in a conversation about actually working through the process of becoming designated as a foreign trade zone. And we'll just do super quick geography. So I keep saying zone 46 and 47. Regrettably, the Federal Trade Administration hasn't come up with anything more interesting except numeric kind of coding for all of these zones. And so, we just thought we'd throw a map up there for you in the Cincinnati region. This is our service territory. This is the area in which we are responsible for managing foreign trade zone. We can be a sponsor to companies considering activation outside of this footprint. It's just got an extra step or two inside of the process. Customs wants to make sure they can reach you and find you and monitor you. But this is where we are focused in these collection of counties in Southwest Ohio and Northern Kentucky. We'll walk through a handful of the list of benefits provided on the screen. And just a quick note on the ad valorem taxes, that's a benefit to Kentucky. So Kentucky does carry additional tax benefits for personal property. Personal property in Ohio is at 0 and has been for years, but there is an additional benefit in Kentucky in consideration of that inside of their tax code. These are some of the permitted activities. So on the prior slide, there was a list of benefits and things that you can do to actually realize some financial savings. And inside of each of those larger categories of, duty deferral or in inverted tariff, there are permitted things that you're able to do in a zone that Customs will either give you permission for or that are just a natural part of the function of an FTZ. I think one of the interesting ones is, being able to destroy. I believe that's a special privilege from Customs. So when you're in your manufacturing process and you have material that is residual coming off the line, or you've had something that didn't come out so well, you're able to take advantage of your FTZ benefit and not totally let that completely go to waste. So there are some, little bit of nuance of other benefits, maybe not so much as we'll see in the big major categories that we'll talk about. And then companies actually use FTZs for different reasons. Return on investment is a very personal, individual, company-specific thing. And, we have one company in Cincinnati who's not an active zone, but they take advantage of leasing space from a foreign trade zone operator so they can relabel their product, so they can be in compliance with the Food and Drug Administration, because they're getting held up at the, border in Canada. They're not, getting through customs quickly because of this issue. So a foreign trade zone is their solution. So I'm going to turn it over to Samantha because she actually does these. So these are the major categories of benefits, and we really simplified them just in some widget examples from Japan. But Samantha can explain the benefit and then maybe how that applies to Festo, or what they're taking advantage of and how they're realizing some of the advantages.
Sure, no problem, Melissa. So this is an extremely large portion, if you are a manufacturer with a foreign trade zone, that you could be using. And so in this example, switches from Japan are being entered, so they would cost you 5% of your cost, are going to be what your duty rate would be. If you take them into your foreign trade zone and say you don't use them in manufacturing, you're just going to hold them and you're going to actually export them to Germany. If you do export those from the US, you don't owe duty. They didn't enter the commerce of the US, and therefore no duty needs to be paid on them. And if you want to go to the next slide, Todd. So inverted tariff. So those same switches, if we're going to bring them into the foreign trade zone, we're going to use them to manufacture. In this example, they're saying treadmills. Would cost you 5% if you were to import those switches and you weren't bringing them into your foreign trade zone. If you're going to do it in the foreign trade zone and make them into treadmills, you are then able to enter those treadmills at only the 2% duty rate. And it can also work the other way. So for Festo, we bring in component parts to make cylinders. Those component parts could have 2% duty tariff, 5% duty tariff, maybe even 8% duty tariff. We're going to manufacture them into a finished good cylinder. Those finished good cylinders have a 0% duty rate. So by utilizing the FTZ, we have thereby eliminated the duty on those components. Now, if it happened to work the other way for some reason, like in this example, they were bringing in switches that were 5%, say they were using them in a product that the final duty rate on the finished good was 10%, they would be able to use the 5% for the components. So that's a great benefit. I think for us, inverted tariff is a big benefit. It is something that you need to have approved by Customs. It's not, I don't think, Melissa, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe that that is directly part of the foreign trade zone program. That is one of the ones that they need to approve you for.
I am actually not totally sure if that's kind of a permissions-based benefit, but I think while Todd catches up with us, I think duty deferral is another benefit. Samantha, if you'd like to walk us through, what duty deferral is and, what exactly that could mean to a company.
Sure. So duty deferral or cash flow, however you want to, really refer to that. Because you're bringing products into the zone and not paying anything on them while you hold them in your zone, while you use them in your manufacturing process, you're only going to pay those duties and taxes when they actually exit your foreign trade zone. So say for some reason you get a very good deal from your your supplier, and you're going to buy 1,000 units in January, and you're only going to sell a few of those units maybe in the first quarter, and your majority are going to be in the last quarter of the year. You're going to hold on to those duties and tariffs that have been on those 1,000 parts, and you're only going to pay them as they leave the zone. So that can be a great benefit depending on what your tariff rates really are, to kind of let that.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, there are additional benefits that some companies think offer more to them than the financial, benefit of the duty deferral or cost of capital, or maybe they're not being, maybe they're not the importer of record and they're just trying to, get through some logistical benefit or a tax benefit like we talked about in some of our other jurisdictions. Samantha, does Festo do weekly entry and reduced MPF or merchandise processing fee? What does that mean to your company?
We do, and for us, that's actually one of the largest benefits we gain from the zone. Because of the way we import our products, right now we can do 52 weekly entries versus probably about 1,700 entries a year. And that reduced MPF, because for your weekly entry, you're going to hit the maximum. They just changed it, so I'm going to throw a number out that I'm sure is not quite correct, but it's roughly $517 is your maximum MPF you would have per entry. So depending on how you're importing your goods, you could conceivably hit that on every entry you do. But because we have those weekly entries, there's your 52, that's your max that you would hit.
And I'm sure our manufacturers know what MPF is. That's the fee that you have to pay when you do the customs declaration.
Correct. That's the merchandise processing fee. That's I think I should know this off the top of my head, but I'm going to have to admit that it's escaping me at the moment. It's 3.05%, I believe, of your value of your goods that you're paying in MPF.
And I think it's worthwhile, on the very bottom of the screen, there's duty deferral on production equipment. So as you're setting up a zone or you're working through establishing your own equipment for your manufacturing process, FTZ benefits can't extend to that production equipment until a time, I believe, it's placed into service. You can enjoy that duty deferral on some of those big machines that you're bringing in to actually, run your company and do your day-to-day. So there are a lot of nuance inside of the FTZ program that you can really piece together as a puzzle of your own return on investment that will make sense to you at the end of the day and what's worth that investment.
And I think, Melissa, it's true. It's very individual for every operator that's in the FTZ program, which ones really make a difference for them. And which ones really, kind of fit into this return on investment example or return on investment, for them.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a genericized calculation that we just did as a matter of an exercise. We think it's important to be able to demonstrate some of the inputs and outputs of a foreign trade zone. In the top half of the table, we have, those benefits. And I believe this example was an assumption of a $30 million import, I think. And so there's some assumptions that there's that scrapping or the destruction, and there's ongoing duty deferral, the merchandise processing fee that Samantha outlined, and some other total savings that the company in this example is realizing over the course of a 5-year investment. So at the end of 5 years, looks like they've totaled just shy of $5 million. And so we do see companies that take those earnings or those savings, they reinvest them back into workforce, their own just kind of bottom line or facility improvements, whatever it might be. But on the bottom half of this table are some of the expenses. Of course, there is expenses related to operating the zone. The biggest line item, and Samantha, I'll let you comment on this if you'd like, is the inventory software, the FTZ software expense. I mean, so customs is, they're pretty interested in where your inventory is. They want to make sure you know where your inventory is because it's not been subject to that tariff. And so otherwise, if you lose it, they actually view it as theft. So that's a really kind of paramount element of operating the zone. The other fees are, just being a part of the operator agreement or some other, mundane fees that get applied here and there. But the operator inventory software is significant.
That's probably the most major one out of them. And I think each time that we do one of these and I look at this ROI, I always think we have in there, the FTZ administrator costs and the operational expenses. And then I think that, sometimes we have to remember we would have those as an importer regardless.
Mm-hmm.
But that software is really something that you can't do without if you're an operator, and really would be over and above whatever you would have. Us as importers still have a legal responsibility for a lot of this stuff. So maybe we wouldn't call it an FTZ administrator. Maybe we would call it an import analyst or somebody that was really kind of doing the oversight. But that software is really paramount to how your zone runs, and even I'll say to how well your experience can be with your customs officers for the zone.
Mm-hmm.
The easier it's going to be to get the information they want in the format they want is going to make, both of the lives much easier on both sides.
And so we just, we think it's important just to say, who does this really work for? And as I mentioned, we say, obviously, importers of any kind of product really in distribution, warehousing, or manufacturing. There's not really a benchmark, since we've said, multiple times that ROI can be very specific and very personal. But we think where it really starts to pencil out for a company is if you're importing probably at least 3 million, there might be enough benefit in some form or fashion to at least consider it, at least talk about and internally talk about, consult your tax expert or your legal expert on how you piece together and knit together the benefits that we've discussed today, either in those really large buckets or otherwise. So we've, obviously, we talked about a number of trendy items in the whether political realm, and we've seen some interesting, movement around COVID, of course, and in the pandemic. An example, of course, is the companies facing stockpiles of merchandise. We have an operator here in Zone 47 who's in the textiles industry. So they found themselves with a lot of jeans on their hands, like a lot of, denim, and coming out of China or wherever, and nowhere to place it. The stores weren't open, and because of the tariff on textiles is pretty significant, they were in just, hunt mode nationally, actually trying to place inventory coming in from their supply chain that they just had to, really find a solution for. And, some of the others, obviously delays in time of payment until the closer point of sale for a cash flow. We've definitely seen some companies concerned with that, as well as they try and, consider the foreign trade zone for solutions and answers inside of that. Samantha, is there anything you want to comment on for Festo specifically, or has, anything else you want to add to the slide for sake of time?
I just think that in respect to COVID-19, that all of these companies that were kind of shut down for that little bit, nobody really knew exactly what was going on. Sales were a little spotty, operations were a little more difficult, that this really became helpful. Where, if anybody who was in that FTZ program could kind of sit on that inventory until we kind of righted ourselves and figured out what the movements forward were going to be. And even having that direct delivery, which was kind of a few slides ago, really made it a little bit easier. I think things slowed down a lot with COVID, even with the government, with the ports, with all of those port workers, that having some of those things in place just made things run a little bit more smoothly.
Well, Todd, I think that, that wraps up our, quick FTZ 101. So I'll turn it back to you for any other closing comments or questions.
Yeah, we're coming up on time. I mean, I think there's a couple of things to say here. I mean, first of all, thank you for sharing all that information. Obviously every company has to make this analysis internally, on their own. but that's what you do. And you know, if anybody has, yeah, we've got some manufacturers on the line. We've got service providers. You know, if you're an accounting firm, a law firm, and you know your clients might be interested in that. You know, reach out to Melissa. Reach out to me. You know, we can connect you to the people that can help you do that analysis. I think the other thing I would just mention is, you know, since COVID came up, and you know, we talk about also the sort of the broader trade policy issues. I mean, I think the one thing that is certain coming out of the pandemic is that every company is now doing a complete reassessment of its supply chains, and they talk about regionalization and nationalization, and you know, shortening and restructuring supply chains. And this is exactly the right time to have that discussion and to think about, you know, what does this mean for my business? So, you know, are there some advantages that I can take here? We are just about out of time. David, did you have any last comments? I mean, do the firms you work with, does this calculate into some of the stuff that you do with your clients?
Absolutely. We tell clients all the time about the FTZ option because it is a great way to save money. And if companies are indeed concerned with the bottom line, then they should consider the FTZ as a potential tool for savings, for tariff savings.
Yeah. Well, I think the one thing that we've heard today is that you know, regardless of who wins the election, trade policy is still going to be very, very important. We know that it is important to the companies in our region. We know it's important to companies around the world, and you know, we hope that this has given companies some ideas about how you can take advantage of some of the tools that are out there to mitigate your risk and improve your bottom line. So that concludes today's webinar entitled Managing Trade Risk in Turbulent Times. I want to say thanks again to our speakers, David Schwartz from Thompson Hine, Melissa Johnson from the Cincinnati Foreign Trade Zones, and a member of the EACC Board of Directors, and to Samantha Wagner of Festo. All three are EACC member companies, and we appreciate that. But thanks to all of you for sharing your knowledge, your experience, and thanks, of course, to our audience for joining us today. Just a reminder, all comments and opinions presented by our speakers today are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the European American Chamber of Commerce or its members. We will be emailing a copy of the slide presentation to everyone who registered for this event, and also a link to the recording once it is posted to our YouTube channel. And as I said, if you'd like to follow up with any of our panelists, please be sure to reach out to me for a connection. I'd encourage you also to check out our webpage, europe-cincinnati.com, for more information on other EACC events and programs, as well as links to our YouTube channel and our other social media accounts. So again, on behalf of Samantha, David, Melissa, and myself, thanks again for joining us, and have a good day.